And like I said, let's call the United States versus Kara Bassett, and my name is Judge Falkenstein. Can the attorneys please make appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Getawchew, and I, along with my second chair, Skylar Walker.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
We represent the United States government in today's case.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Catherine Morris, representing the defendant Kara Bassett in today's case. I'm assisted by my co-counsel, Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Good afternoon,
morning.
Your Honor, members of the jury, and opposing counsel.
Good afternoon and good morning to everyone, depending where you are. Do we have any pretrial matters?
Yes, Your Honor. The government has a few pretrial matters. First, we'd
Let's
like to
hear
raise the court's attention to Pretrial Order 7, which states that Exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted into evidence.
Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, Your Honor.
In addition, Your Honor, there are some exhibits that haven't been pre-admitted, which may be entered in evidence in court today. Since it's hard to show witnesses exhibits to authenticate them over Zoom without also showing the jury at the same time, our plan was to ask witnesses to keep a copy of the case so that we can ask them questions about an exhibit without showing it to the jury. Is it all right then if we ask that witnesses keep a copy of the case on their laptop to make it quicker and easier to authenticate?
Does opposing counsel have any issue with that?
No, Your Honor.
And as long as the witnesses have a copy available, that's no problem.
In addition, Your Honor, due to the unusual nature of doing a trial over Zoom, it's also difficult or impossible to show opposing counsel an exhibit the same way we would in real trial. Prior to court today, Ms. Morris and I have agreed that we've both seen all the exhibits in the case and we don't need to show each other additional copies during trial if we're trying to enter something into evidence.
Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor, it is.
Okay, that sounds good. Anything else?
Yes, Your Honor. The government would like to raise the court's attention to Rule 603 and assume that all witnesses have been pre-sworn.
Okay, sounds good. Anything?
Lastly, Your Honor, the government would like to invoke Rule 615 and ask that all witnesses be constructively sequestered, barring party representatives, which for the government today is the FBI lead investigator of this case, Agent Steph Brown.
Is there any objection to that?
No, Your Honor, and as the FBI agent will be testifying first, there will be no objection to that.
Okay, sounds good. Are there any other matters?
No, Your Honor. With that, the government is ready to proceed with opening statements.
And do we have anything from defense?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense would like to raise the court's attention to Stipulation 9, stating that the defendant is in today's trial, but due to the online setting, there's no need for any witness to identify her.
So noted. Anything else?
With that, Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed with opening statements.
Sure. Before we proceed with openings, everyone should make sure that they're now in speaker view. That button's on the right of top right corner of your screen. And I'm going to do that right now. And attorneys, make sure that when you're not speaking, you have yourself muted as well. We can hear openings. Oh.
Your Honor, while mine says I'm not muted, I have a separate mic system, so I will be on mute. It just won't say I am.
Okay, that's no problem. And we're ready to hear from the government?
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court, the members of the jury. A plan for power. That's why you'll learn the defendant murdered her husband, Don Clark. You'll learn that when the defendant felt powerless, when the defendant wanted something that Don Clark refused to give, she made a plan for power. The man in this photo is Don Clark. Don Clark was a loving father and a devoted husband to his wife, Kara Bassett, the defendant. You'll learn that while the defendant didn't make her own money, Don Clark was a multi-millionaire. Everything the defendant had was what Don Clark would pay for. But you'll learn that there was one thing the defendant desperately wanted that Don Clark didn't want to pay for. Power. You see, the defendant and Don Clark owned an elephant zoo together, called the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park in Florida. You'll learn that the defendant didn't agree with zoos. She thought it was unethical to use a business and abuse animals for profit. So she wanted to convert their zoo into a nonprofit sanctuary. Since Dawn Clark controlled all of the finances, the defendant didn't have the power to make that decision on her own. So she made a plan for power. On August 18, 2017, the defendant put her plan into action. She murdered her husband, Don Clark, with a lethal elephant tranquilizer and dumped his body in the swamp. Now, that's why we, the government, have charged the defendant with the murder of Don Clark. This means that we hold the burden of proof in court today. We have to prove to you that the defendant intentionally killed Don Clark. We have to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. But all this means is that our story has to be the only reasonable story. And we'll meet this burden in court today, because the evidence will show you that the defendant killed her husband in her plan for power. Let's talk about the defendant's plan. When FBI agent Steph Branham takes the stand today, he'll tell you that the defendant injected her husband with carfentanil, an elephant tranquilizer 5,000 times as toxic as heroin, to kill him. You'll see the GPS records from Don Clark's van on the night of the murder. They'll prove to you that the defendant drove his dead body to a swamp to dump it. Agent Branham will show you all the physical evidence that proves that Don Clark's dead body was in the back of that van, and the defendant was the driver. You'll also see the defendant's phone records in court today. You'll see that the entire week she claimed her husband had gone missing, not once did the defendant attempt to contact him, because she knew exactly where Don Clark was. He had a plan for power. But why did the defendant need power? Well, you'll learn that prior to his death, Don Clark signed a power of attorney agreement. If Don Clark died or disappeared, the defendant would inherit millions of dollars and control of all of his businesses and finances. A few weeks after the murder, the defendant used her power. She converted their zoo into a nonprofit animal sanctuary. Her plan had worked. The defendant finally had that power. Which is why at the end of this trial, I'll come before you again and ask that you find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you. Opening statements from defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Dead or alive? That's the question in today's trial. The prosecution just got in front of you and told you that Kara Bassett murdered Don Clark. But the evidence in today's trial will show that we don't even know if there was a murder. So is Don Clark dead or alive? The prosecution will not be able to tell you that today. You'll hear that they won't be able to tell you if Don Clark is in Costa Rica, if he's dead, or even if he's alive. And members of the jury, that's because you'll find out no one knows. Not Miss Bassett, not Agent Branham, the lead investigator for today's trial, and not the United States government. If the prosecution can't prove that Don Clark is dead, then at the end of today's trial, you will not be able to convict Miss Bassett. Now, the reason the question if Don Clark is dead or alive is so important is because the prosecution has the burden of proof. They have to prove the defendant's guilt today beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest burden in our justice system. Members of the jury, what you need to remember is that Miss Bassett doesn't have a burden. She doesn't have to prove Mr. Clark is alive. The prosecution has to prove that he's dead. It's the defense's position that the prosecution will not be able to do that today. And because of that, members of the jury, they won't be able to meet their burden. You won't be able to convict Miss Bassett. They'll try to meet their burden, though. They'll present to you documents and records, but these will raise questions. They won't tell you if Don Clark is dead. They'll present to you the testimony of Agent Branham. Their testimony will raise questions because even he can't prove that Don Clark is dead. What you need to remember in today's trial, especially when listening to the testimony of Agent Branham, is that the absence of evidence isn't evidence. Today, we predict that you'll hear 3 times the prosecution try to use the absence of evidence in today's case as evidence. First, through those documents and records. You'll hear about phone records, maybe even bank records, and a GPS report. But listen to how none of those actually show Miss Bassett murdered her husband. You'll hear Agent Branham talk about an elephant tranquilizer, a missing syringe, and how that's the murder weapon. But listen for how they don't have the syringe. They don't have evidence Miss Bassett used the syringe on Mr. Clark. And then you'll hear Agent Branham testify that Don Clark is dead. But listen for how there's no blood, no signs of violence, and no body. Members of the jury, when there isn't sufficient evidence to prove someone is dead, that means there isn't sufficient evidence to convict someone of murder. We don't know if Don Clark is dead or alive. And if you still don't know at the end of today's trial, the state will not have met their burden. And I'll come before you again and I'll ask you to find Miss Bassett not guilty.
Thank you. And before we proceed with the government's case, if everyone could make sure they switch now back to gallery view, that way you'll be able to see both advocates and myself as well on the screen. Okay, and if the government's ready to call their first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The government calls FBI agent Steph Branham to the stand.
And you've already been sworn in.
Before I begin, I'd like to remind Your Honor of Pretrial Order 7, which states that Exhibits 4 through 33 have been pre-admitted. One of those exhibits is the forensics report, Exhibit 5, which this witness will refer in his testimony.
Understood.
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Branham, can you see and hear me correctly?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Special Agent Stephen Branham for the FBI, and I apologize for my room. I've been working from home lately.
Why are you testifying in court today?
Well, I led the investigation into the disappearance of Don Clark.
You mentioned that you led the disappearance until Don Clark. When did Don Clark disappear?
Well, we received a phone call on August 25th, 2017 from the defendant, in which we were informed that he had disappeared the week before on August 18th, 2017.
Who is Don Clark?
Well, Don Clark is a Tallahassee, Florida resident who lives with his wife, Carol Bassett. They also own this elephant zoo together. They call it the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
Were you ever able to find Don Clark?
Unfortunately, ma'am, we were not able to ever find Don Clark. However, we did conclude that this was a homicide.
In your homicide investigation, did you make an arrest for Don Clark's murder?
Yes, ma'am, we did. We arrested the defendant, Carol Bassett, for the murder on September 12th, 2018.
In a minute, I'll ask you to go through all the details of your investigation. But first, I want the jury to get to know a little bit more about your background. How long have you worked for the FBI?
I have worked for the FBI for over 18 years. I've investigated more than 100 cases, including murder, serial murder, and kidnapping.
You testified that you arrested the defendant for her husband's murder. I want to go through all the evidence in your investigation that led you to that conclusion.
All right.
What was the first significant piece of evidence that led you to believe that the defendant committed this crime?
Well, the first significant piece of evidence was the physical evidence that we found in the back of Don Clark's van when we searched it on August 25th, 2017.
Did you conduct any forensics testing on that evidence?
Yes, ma'am. We sent 6 pieces of hairs that we found in the back of the van to our forensics teams, in which they concluded it was a match to Don Clark's hair.
Now, you found evidence that Don Clark was in the van the night of the murder. Did you find any evidence that the defendant was in the van the night of the murder?
Yes, ma'am. We found fingerprints on the steering wheel that we sent over to our forensics team, in which they also concluded that those were the fingerprints from the defendant, Ms. Bassett.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, the fingerprints inside the van don't have a date. They don't show that Miss Bassett was in the van on August 18th, 2017, meaning that this is an improper opinion, that him stating these fingerprints show she was in the van the night of the murder.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
This witness is merely testifying that the fingerprints they found on the steering wheel match the defendant's. This evidence has already been admitted under Exhibit 5, which has already been pre-admitted. Furthermore, Your Honor, this witness is going to explain the GPS records of that van, showing where it was driven the night of the murder. And Your Honor, this witness will explain that fingerprints don't stay on for a long amount of time. For those fingerprints to be picked up, they have to be fairly recent. Therefore, this is rationally based on this witness's perception under Rule 701.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, he can testify that fingerprints were found in the vehicle. However, he can't say that the fingerprints were there, that Miss Bassett was there on August 18th, 2017. That's an improper opinion, and he isn't an expert in today's case. It goes beyond a rationally based perception and is limited by Rule 701.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
This conclusion is rationally based on this witness's perception because in addition to the fingerprints, the other evidence that this witness has collected has led him to believe that the most likely outcome is that Miss Bassett was in the car the night of the disappearance. Therefore, this conclusion is rationally based on his perception under Rule 701.
Okay, I'll allow him to testify to the fingerprints he's discovered and how it related to his investigation. And Ms. Morris, feel free to cross on the timeline of events related to that.
Yes, Your Honor.
Other than those fingerprints, did you find any other physical evidence that led you to believe the defendant was driving that car?
Yes, ma'am. We also found algae on the gas pedal of the van, on the defendant's boots, as well as the bottom of this wheelchair. When we sent that over to our forensics lab, they concluded that the algae on those items matched the algae from Big Gump Swamp.
Did you find any evidence of where the defendant drove that van?
Yes, ma'am. We picked up GPS records from the van that night in which he traveled.
Ms. Walker, could you show the jury what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 31, the GPS records of Don Clark's van? What did you find in these records, Agent Brown?
What we found in these records is that this van traveled many different places that night, from 11:17 p.m. to 4:30 a.m. the next day.
Ms. Walker, could you show the jury a timeline of the van's whereabouts from 11:17 p.m. on August 18th until August 19th at 4:30 a.m.? Agent Branham, where did the van travel in this time frame?
So the van first started at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, in which it then traveled all the way to Big Gump Swamp, and then finished its travel at the Cary Leon Airport.
Now, you testified to who murdered Don Clark. I want to talk about how. Did you find any evidence of how the defendant murdered Don Clark?
Yes, ma'am. When we searched the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park, we found that there was a missing syringe, so we believe there was an elephant tranquilizer.
Could you explain to the jury what elephant tranquilizer is?
So in this elephant tranquilizer was a substance called carfentanil. It's a highly lethal substance, over 5 times more lethal than heroin.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
Again, these statements that the witness made about carfentanil and its toxicity, this evidence has already been entered as it's included in the toxicity report of carfentanil, which has been pre-admitted.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
While this exhibit might have been admitted, it does not lay the foundation as to this witness's knowledge of carfentanil. They'll have to lay the foundation as to how this witness knows about this report.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
We've already explained that this witness is the lead investigator of this case, and he was explaining that when he searched the elephant park, that's when he learned about this missing syringe of carfentanil. Therefore, we've laid the foundation that this witness would be aware of carfentanil and its toxicity.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Last time, yes.
Doing an investigation of carfentanil doesn't lay the foundation as to how he knows the toxicity level. We just ask that opposing counsel lay the foundation as to his knowledge on the danger level.
Sure, sustained. Counsel, can you please just lay that foundation as to how he knows about the toxicity of this drug?
Move to strike the answer about how toxic carfentanil is until opposing counsel lays the proper foundation.
Stricken.
Agent Branham, when you searched that elephant park, did you learn any information about the toxicity of carfentanil?
Yes,
Objection,
ma'am, we
Your
did. It's also a report that states.
1 second. I think there's an objection. Sorry.
Honor. Leading.
Yes.
Your Honor, I don't believe this is a leading question. I wasn't inferring an answer to this question. I merely asked this witness when he searched that park if he found any information about the toxicity in carfentanil.
Overruled. You can answer.
I'll ask the question again, Agent Branham. When you searched the elephant park, did you find any information about the toxicity of carfentanil?
Yes, ma'am. We looked into the toxicity of it, and a MSDS report that kind of listed the toxifications of carfentanil.
What did you learn from that report?
Well, from what we learned is that it was over 5,000 times more lethal than heroin. It's a very lethal substance.
How did you know that there was a syringe missing?
Well, there was a logbook in which they kept these carfentanyls logged, and they logged 24 on August 1st, 2017. However, when we checked the park, there's only 23.
Now, you testified to who murdered Don Clark and how they did it. Now I want to talk about why. Did you find any evidence that the defendant had a motive to kill her husband?
Yes, ma'am. We looked into a power of an attorney agreement.
Could you explain to the jury what a power of attorney agreement is?
So from the evidence I collected in my investigation, the power of an attorney agreement is something in which two parties sign that would hand over assets to one party in case of an unusual circumstance.
Ms. Walker, could you show the jury what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 15, Don Clark's power of attorney? How much power was the defendant granted in this document?
The defendant would have been granted about millions of dollars and money, as well as the business, the park at the time.
Did the defendant ever use that power?
Yes, ma'am, she did. On October 2017, she changed what was then the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park into a sanctuary.
Could you explain to the jury what the difference is between a zoo and a sanctuary?
Well, to my knowledge, a zoo is a business. It's a place where elephants and animals are kept in cages, and people can interact with them. However, an elephant sanctuary is a non-profit business in which people are free from touching the animals, and the animals are free from cages.
Did the defendant ever explain to you why she waited until after Don Clark's death to make that change?
Yes, ma'am, she did in an interrogation. She said that it was unethical to leave these animals in cages like that, and she had to do something about that.
From what the defendant told you, was she ever able to convince Don Clark to agree with her while he was alive?
No, ma'am, she was not.
Agent Branham, based on all the evidence in your investigation, how did you conclude that only the defendant could have been responsible?
Well, based on the means, the motive, and the opportunity, we concluded that she was the person likely able to kill Don Clark.
Objection, Your Honor. This goes beyond the lay witness's opinion and goes into giving an expert opinion on today's case.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Nothing of what this witness just said is based on any scientific, technical, or otherwise specialized knowledge. Therefore, this is not an expert opinion. Under Rule 701, witnesses can give conclusions and opinions in their testimony if they are rationally based on this witness's perception. This statement is rationally based on this witness's perception due to all the steps of his investigation and the evidence he collected.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, this opinion is both unfairly prejudicial and goes against jury instruction 10, which states that the arrest of Ms. Bassett cannot be used as evidence. Opposing counsel is attempting to use this conclusion to show that because Ms. Bassett was arrested, she's then guilty, and this opinion is improper and unfairly prejudicial.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yeah, please first respond to the 403 that it's unfairly prejudicial, and then explain, please, the jury instruction.
Yes, Your Honor. In order for evidence to be excluded under Rule 403, its probative value has to be substantially outweighed by its risk of unfair prejudice. This witness's testimony, the answer he just gave, is incredibly probative, as it gives the jury insight as to why this witness, as a lead investigator, would conclude that the defendant was responsible due to all the evidence he collected in his investigation. There is no substantial risk of unfair prejudice. Therefore, this is not more prejudicial than probative under Rule 403. As to opposing counsel's objection to us violating the jury instructions, this witness was not testifying that because Ms. Bassett was arrested, that means she's guilty. He was merely offering the opinion of why the FBI concluded that the defendant was responsible based on all the evidence he collected. He was merely concluding that based on the evidence he collected, they found that the defendant was the person with the means and the motive and the opportunity.
Okay, I will allow that testimony as long as you don't get into the arrest and the specifics of that itself.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Agent Branham. Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Any cross from defense?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Agent Branham, I want to talk about your theory on today's case that you discussed on direct examination.
All right.
Now, first, you concluded that a syringe, a missing elephant tranquilizer, was the murder weapon, right?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am.
You never found this syringe, did you?
No, ma'am, we weren't able to find this syringe, which is why we believe it is the murder weapon, due to the fact that they logged 24, but it was only 23.
But you never found it? The empty syringe you never found?
No, ma'am, we never found it.
And your next conclusion was that Miss Bassett used that syringe on Mr. Clark, right?
Yes, ma'am, that was our conclusion.
You found no security footage of Miss Bassett injecting Mr. Clark with a syringe?
Oh, no, ma'am, we found no security footage.
No eyewitnesses? You didn't find any eyewitnesses that showed Miss Bassett injecting Mr. Clark with a syringe?
No, ma'am, we found no eyewitnesses either.
No. Agent Branham, Miss Bassett is 5'4", isn't that true?
To my understanding, yes, ma'am.
Mr. Clark, he was 6'5", isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am, he was 6'5".
So your theory is that Miss Bassett, after injecting him with an elephant tranquilizer, somehow lifted him into a wheelchair for transportation?
Not somehow, ma'am. We conclude that she did lift him into this wheelchair and dump his body in Big Gum Swamp.
You're concluding that she lifted the dead weight of Mr. Clark into this wheelchair, right?
I don't know what you're implying, ma'am, but we did conclude that she was able to lift his body and put it in a wheelchair.
All right. You then believe that she wheeled the wheelchair to a van, correct?
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
You found no security footage of this, right?
No, ma'am, we found no security footage.
Then you're aware that that van she used wasn't wheelchair accessible, right?
To my understanding, it was a big van, so I can't really say.
But it wasn't wheelchair accessible, right?
You could probably fit a wheelchair in that van, yes, ma'am. I wouldn't say that it's specifically a wheelchair accessible van, but there are ways to fit a wheelchair in a van.
Let me be clearer, Agent Branham. There is no wheelchair lift inside the standard 15-passenger van, isn't that right?
Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
So somehow you believe Miss Bassett was able to lift the wheelchair with Mr. Clark in it into the van.
Once again, ma'am, I don't agree with the use of somehow. We do know that she did that, yes, ma'am.
With no security footage, right?
No security footage.
And no eyewitnesses?
As I stated, no eyewitnesses, ma'am.
All right. You then believe she drove to Big Gum Swamp.
That is correct.
And at Big Gum Swamp, Miss Bassett wheeled Mr. Clark through this swamp, right?
She did wheel him. I don't know if that's the precise location. Like I said, I would need a much larger picture of the swamp, but we do believe she wheeled him into this swamp, yes, ma'am.
Agent Branham, you took this photo, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. That's just one of the photos I took.
So based on the location you were in this photo, you're aware that this is the swamp she would have had to wheel Mr. Clark through?
Based on the location of this photo, yes, ma'am.
You're aware that there are alligators in this swamp?
Yes, ma'am. There are alligators in this swamp.
And based on the GPS record you talked about on direct examination, Miss Bassett took approximately 44 minutes at this swamp.
Yes, ma'am.
You investigated this swamp after you were aware Mr. Clark was missing.
That is correct, yes, ma'am.
You were assisted by an FBI team.
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
As well as trained dogs.
We did bring trained dogs, yes, ma'am.
You never found Mr. Clark's body, isn't that right?
No, ma'am, we didn't. But like you mentioned before, those alligators could have played a part.
All right, well, you never found a shoe of Mr. Clark.
Well, I don't know precisely what he was wearing that night, so I don't know why a shoe would be relevant now.
You never found any clothes in the swamp of Mr. Clark.
No, ma'am, if he was eaten, I don't see why there would be clothes left over.
You believe if elephants ate Mr. Clark, they also ate his shoes?
I'm sorry, not elephants, alligators.
Alligators, pardon me. You believe that they would eat all of his clothes and his shoes?
They would eat what they could eat, yes, ma'am.
All right. Now let's move on to talk about what Miss Bassett did after the swamp. She
All right.
then drove to the Carrie Bell Leon Airport, as your theory goes.
As according to the GPS record shows, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I want to clarify something. The GPS record doesn't say Miss Bassett was driving the vehicle, does it?
No, ma'am. It just says that the van traveled from the swamp to the airport.
All right, so Mr. Clark's van drove from the swamp to the Carrie Bell Leon Airport.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
the van stayed there, didn't it?
It did say that, yes, ma'am.
So and it arrived at 4:30 in the morning, correct?
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
Your theory is that Miss Bassett somehow walked with the wheelchair back to the elephant park that night, right?
Well, we didn't say walk, but we know that she got back to the park somehow, one way or another, ma'am.
The park was 7 miles from the airport?
About 7 miles, yes, ma'am.
All right, now let's move on to the algae you talked about on direct examination. You believe that the algae on Miss Bassett's shoes was from Big Gum Swamp.
Well, that's what our forensics report concluded, ma'am, not necessarily what I believe.
Let's talk about the forensic report. Why don't we pull that up? Let's highlight a specific portion from that based on the algae.
All right.
You're aware that this says the match is not certain based on this forensic report, isn't that right?
Well, yes, I agree with what you're eliciting here, but you're forgetting that but highly likely portion of it, ma'am.
All right, but they're not certain?
Not certain, but highly likely, yes, ma'am.
And they didn't test the samples against Big Gum Swamp, did they?
I'm confused with what you're eliciting here.
They didn't test the algae from Miss Bassett's boots against the elephant park, right?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
All right, we can put that down. I want to talk to you about Mandy Tuminelli, Mr. Clark's lawyer.
All right.
Now, I want to pull up the email response you got from her, Exhibit 4. Why don't you pull that up, Ms. Kirkpatrick? I want to highlight one specific portion.
Okay.
Before you arrested the defendant, you were aware Mr. Clark planned to purchase properties in Costa Rica?
That's correct, yes, ma'am.
Before you arrested the defendant, you were aware he planned to do so with money off the books?
According to what this letter told me, yes, ma'am.
And before you arrested the defendant, you knew Mr. Clark wanted to do so without Miss Bassett's knowledge?
Once again, according to this letter, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. No further questions.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Branham, in your investigation, did you find any evidence that Don Clark was ever seen or heard from again after August 18th, 2017?
No, ma'am, I did not.
In your experience investigating kidnappings and murders, is it standard to conclude that a case is a homicide, even if you haven't found a body, if that person has gone missing?
Yes, ma'am. Sometimes you can prove a homicide without a body.
Thank you, Agent Branham. Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Anything further from this witness? Or is he free to step down?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay, you can go, Agent.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anything else from the government?
No, Your Honor, the government rests.
Okay, is defense ready to proceed with their case?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Joe Young to the stand.
Ms. Young, you've been sworn in.
Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Hi, my name is Joe Young.
Miss Young, what do you do for a living?
I'm a film producer. I actually film reality TV and documentaries. You've probably heard of me before. I've done some pretty big names.
Do you know the defendant in today's case, Miss Bassett?
Yeah, I do.
How do you know her?
Well, Kara came up to me in 2015 and asked if I could film a documentary about her elephant park. And of course I said yes. She was a big fan of my films.
When did you start filming your documentary?
That was around August of 2015.
When did you end filming?
2018.
How much film do you have from those 3 years of filming?
I have over 2,000 hours of film.
For today's case, how much of that film did you end up showing the police?
You know, now that I think about it, the police never asked me about any of it.
I want to talk about Mr. Clark. In your 3 years of filming, did you ever meet Mr. Don Clark?
Yeah, I saw him at the park every day.
How well do you know him?
Really well, actually. Yeah, like I said, I saw him every day, and so we got pretty close.
Did you ever see Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark together?
Yeah, I filmed a lot of them together.
How would you describe their relationship based on what you saw?
You know, they're one of the most loving and sweet couples I know. Don Clark would dote on her, buying her elephant trinkets, and Kara would tease him back. They were both really passionate people. They were passionate about elephants. It was just really fun to film them.
Do you remember the last time you spoke with Mr. Clark?
Yeah, I do.
What day was that?
That was August 18th, the day he disappeared.
Do you remember what the two of you talked about?
Yeah, it was around 6 p.m. I would just mentioned a trip I was planning that night, and it was actually kind of a weird conversation.
Why was it a weird conversation?
Well, while we were talking, Mr. Clark got a text from his phone. He looked down on it, and his face turned white, like sheet white. He looked really scared, and he said he had to deal with something. And then he just walked off in the middle of our conversation, and that was the last time I saw him.
I want to clarify, was this a phone call or a text message?
He looked down at his phone, and then he walked off.
All right, now let's pull up Mr. Clark's phone records, Exhibit 21. You saw this on 64 Minutes. Based on the time you saw him look down at his phone, which one of these calls lines up with that same time?
I see a call at 6 p.m. there. So that one, I think.
Who called him at 6 p.m.?
An unlisted number in San Jose, Costa Rica. It was an outgoing call.
How long did the call last?
52 minutes.
All right, now we can pull that exhibit down. Thank you, Ms. Kirkpatrick. Miss Young, you just talked that you saw Mr. Clark on August 18th, 2017. Did you see Miss Bassett that day?
Yeah, she was with him all day.
How was Miss Bassett acting in your opinion?
It seemed pretty normal. Normal Kara. She's always excited about elephants and Dawn. So yeah, it seemed like a pretty normal day.
What did you do after you were at the elephant park that day with Mr. Clark and Miss Bassett?
I had a trip planned that night. I had a red-eye to Mexico, and so I left around 11.
Did you ever come back to the elephant park after your trip?
Yeah, I did. August 26th.
What happened on August 26th?
Well, I came home, unpacked, and then I went to work as normal. And when I got there, the FBI was there. And so I asked what was going on, and they said Mr. Clark had disappeared.
How long did you see the FBI stay at the elephant park?
They stayed there till September and then came around once a month to ask questions.
Did they ever ask you questions?
Yeah, that was kind of a weird thing. Like, I had been at the park for 3 years, and every day during that entire 3 years, and they didn't ask me very many questions. But they asked.
Oh, sorry, continue.
No, that's it.
All right, now what did you see the FBI do when they were conducting their investigation on the elephant park?
Yeah, that was also another strange part. Actually, so Kara had me film them the entire time and trail along their backs just to see what they were doing, make sure they were doing a good investigation. And I saw them most of the time looking through the elephant enclosures. Like, what, did they think elephants did it? I also saw that they were handling some of the evidence without gloves, particularly the syringes, and I actually saw them reprimanded for that.
All right, now let's talk about that syringe. Based on your personal knowledge on how long you were at the elephant park, do you know what that syringe was?
Yeah, so I saw Kara and I filmed her with the syringe like that. It's a syringe of elephant tranquilizer, and it's really dangerous. That's why I was concerned about the way the FBI was handling them.
Do you know where those syringes are kept?
They're kept in a locked medicine shed.
Who have you seen has access to that elephant shed?
Oh, about a dozen people, staff, doctors, lots of people.
I want to move on to talk about your documentary. Did you ever film footage based on Mr. Clark's disappearance for your documentary?
Yeah, I actually did. So it had been a year. The FBI hadn't found Don Clark at all, and I was wanting to do a little bit of investigating myself. So I actually went down to Costa Rica to check some things out.
Why did you go to Costa Rica?
Well, Don Clark has a vacation home there, and he flies there a lot on vacation. He actually has his own private plane.
Where in Costa Rica did you go?
I went to Hermosa Beach, to Mr. Clark's vacation home there.
What did you find at Mr. Clark's vacation home?
You know, that was the strange thing. So I walked in, and the house was spotless. Like, there was no dust. And I looked up, and the fans were on. And I went into his closet, and I saw Mr. Clark's clothes hanging in the closet after over a year. Like, I saw his Bermuda shorts there, his flamingo shirt, and it was then I didn't know whether Don was dead or alive.
Thank you, Miss Young. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Young, I want to talk about the real reason you're testifying in court today. You have millions of dollars at stake, right?
Yeah, I got paid $5,000 a week by Miss Bassett, and yeah, I'm being paid $2 million for this documentary, but it's what I'm worth.
Right, just like you said. You've been offered $10 million to produce the documentary about the defendant, right?
Yeah, well, one of the streaming companies offered Miss Bassett $10 million, and I get 20% of that.
You'll agree with me, if the star of your documentary were convicted of murder, that could lead to some bad press.
I don't know. I guess so, yeah.
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for witness to speculate.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
This is rationally based on this witness's perception. This witness has experience in show business and would know that if the star of her documentary were convicted of a crime, especially one that's so violent, such as murder, that could lead to controversy. Not only is this rationally based on this witness's perception due to her experience in show business, it's also common sense, Your Honor.
May I be heard,
Yeah.
Your Honor?
Sure.
This actually, we don't know if Miss Bassett being convicted of murder could actually cause more people to watch it or less people. This answer is speculative.
I'm going to overrule it, and if the witness doesn't know, she's free to answer that she doesn't know.
Yes, Your Honor. You'll agree that bad press from the defendant's murder conviction, that could lead to some controversy, right?
Well, this documentary already is controversial, but yeah, I guess so.
You'll agree that controversy, that can cause your film to be canceled, right?
I've never heard of that. Like, we've already signed the contracts.
But you'll agree with me. Bad press surrounding the star of your documentary, that could affect how much money you make from your documentary, right?
I'm not totally sure, but sure.
And today you've agreed to testify for the defendant.
Yes, because I've seen evidence that Mr. Clark might still be alive.
You've agreed to testify for the star of your documentary.
Yes.
Now you just testified that you think Don Clark is still alive, based on your trip in Costa Rica. But when
Yeah.
you went there, you didn't see a single person enter or leave the house, did you?
Yeah, it was kind of weird, but nope, I didn't see anyone.
When you entered, the lights were off.
That's true, but the fans were on.
And there was no food in the refrigerator, right?
No, there wasn't.
You'll agree that if someone wants to stay alive, they have to eat, right?
Well, yeah, I guess so.
Now, I want to talk about why the defendant would have wanted to murder her husband. You don't think she showed enough concern when Don Clark went missing, right?
Well, she did seem very devastated.
Well, I want to talk about that. You saw the defendant's cell phone records, right?
I did.
Ms. Walker, could you show the jury what's been pre-admitted as Exhibit 22, the defendant's cell phone records? Now, in these records, one day after her husband went missing, the defendant didn't call him.
No, I don't see any calls.
Instead, she called a soup restaurant, isn't that right?
Yeah, Kara likes soup.
3 days after her husband went missing. She didn't call him.
No, I don't see anything.
Again, she called a soup restaurant.
Yeah.
You'll agree with me that in the entire week Don Clark went missing, the defendant didn't even call him once.
I don't think so. You know, Don Clark goes to Costa Rica often, but yeah.
In that week, the defendant called a soup restaurant 3 times when she never even called Don Clark or the police.
Yeah, and if you ever go to Tallahassee, I recommend Super Soups.
I want to talk about why the defendant wasn't concerned. From what you observed of their marriage, Don Clark held all the power, right?
Well, I mean, they were a couple. They enjoyed hanging out with each other, and they both loved each other dearly.
I want to talk about that. Miss Bassett didn't make her own money, right?
No.
Don Clark held all of the finances.
Yes, he did, and he loved to dote on Kara.
Well, you say he loved to dote on Kara. But there was one thing the defendant desperately wanted that Don Clark didn't want to pay for, right?
I'm not sure what you mean.
I'll explain to you what I mean. Prior to Don Clark's death, the elephant park was a zoo, right?
Yes, it was.
You'll agree with me that zoos are treated as businesses?
Yeah, I mean, people came there, they paid.
And sanctuaries are treated as nonprofit organizations, right?
Well, I'm not totally certain about like nonprofit status and all that. I'm a videographer, but sure.
But you'll agree with me that the defendant told you she wanted to convert their zoo into a nonprofit sanctuary, right?
I think I remember her saying that.
But Don Clark disagreed.
Well, yes.
Don Clark told her, this is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way.
Yeah, I think he said that.
Miss Young, could you pull up exhibits 36 and 38 in front of you? Some videos you took?
Sure.
Have anything in these videos been edited or changed since the ones you originally took?
Nope, these were part of the documentary. There were some pretty great shots.
Your Honor, the government would like to enter exhibits 36 and 38 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Ms. Walker,
Therein.
Ms. Walker, could you play for the jury exhibit 36?
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Ms. Walker, could you also play exhibit 38 for the jury?
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
Ms. Young, in the end, after Don Clark went to his grave, the defendant got what she wanted, right?
No.
Well, I want to talk about why she did. It wasn't until after Don Clark died that she had the power to change the elephant park from a zoo to a sanctuary, right?
Objection, Your Honor. We are in court arguing that Mr. Clark is in fact dead.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
It is not an objection for me to contradict the defense's theory that Don Clark is alive.
Your Honor,
Overruled. You can respond.
Your Honor, this witness has no personal knowledge if Mr. Clark is dead. She can testify that after he went missing, Miss Bassett got the elephant zoo changed to a sanctuary. However, she can't testify that she knows Mr. Clark is dead.
May I respond?
You may.
Your Honor, this witness is aware that Don Clark was declared dead, and because he was declared dead, that's when the defendant got the power to change the elephant park.
I'm going to allow this witness to testify as to what happened once he was declared dead or missing. But again, it's the defense's theory that he in fact isn't dead simply because the state declared him dead. So this witness doesn't have to agree to the fact that he is in fact dead.
Yes.
Does that clear it up?
Miss Young, it wasn't until after the defendant had Don Clark declared dead that she finally had the power to change the zoo into a sanctuary, right?
she had to take control of the sanctuary. She was running it. Mr. Clark was dead. But yes, she changed it into a sanctuary.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
Does Miss Young, you can step down. Anything else from defense?
No, Your Honor, the defense rests. However, before we go into closing arguments, may the defense requests a brief recess.
Sure, let's take a 3-minute recess and be back at 12:50 or 9:50, depending where you are.
Your Honor, it is 9:50.
53, I apologize. And at this time, I'll remind all jurors to please change your view to speaker view so that during closing arguments, you only see the advocate who's currently speaking on the screen. And I'll do the same. And it looks like everyone is back. Let me make sure the jurors are, okay. Okay, is the government ready to proceed with closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court, members of the jury, a plan for power. When the defendant had no money, no control, no power, she took it from her husband, Don Clark. When the defendant wanted something that Don Clark refused to give her, she made a plan for power. On August 18, 2017, the defendant murdered her husband, Don Clark. That's why we, the government, have charged the defendant with the murder of Don Clark. This means we hold the burden of proof in today's case. Throughout this trial, we have to prove to you that the defendant intentionally killed Don Clark. We have to prove that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. But all this means is that our story has to be the only reasonable story you hear in court today. And the government has met that burden because the evidence showed you that the defendant killed her husband in her plan for power. Let's talk about the defendant's plan. When FBI agent Steph Branham took the stand today, he told you that at the defendant's elephant park, they keep a detailed log of their use of elephant tranquilizer, carfentanil. Because when you're handling a drug 5,000 times as toxic as heroin, you have to make sure that not a drop of it falls into the wrong hands. You learn that there was a syringe of tranquilizer missing. The defendant knew exactly where it was. You learn that she used that syringe of carfentanil to kill her husband. That was her plan for power. After the defendant killed Don Clark, she placed his dead body in the back of his van. You saw from the forensics report that 6 of Don Clark's hairs were found on the floor in the back of the van. You saw in the GPS records that the van was then driven to a swamp to dump Don Clark's body. And then the defendant planted the car at a nearby airport. You saw that the defendant's fingerprints were on the steering wheel of that van. You learned that the algae on Miss Bassett's boots matched algae from the swamp and matched algae from the van. A plan for power. But why did the defendant need that power? Well, you heard from Joe Young today, who worked with the defendant for years. She told you that the defendant spent years trying to convince Don Clark to convert their zoo into a nonprofit sanctuary. But Don Clark disagreed. He told the defendant, "This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way." And the defendant didn't take that very well.
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
In the end, for disagreeing with his wife, Don Clark paid the price because the defendant made a plan for power. But how was she able to take that power? Well, you saw the power of attorney agreement that Don Clark signed just a few weeks before he died. You learned that if Don Clark died or disappeared, the defendant would inherit millions of dollars and control of all of his businesses, including the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. Just a few weeks after the murder, the defendant used her power. She converted the zoo into an animal sanctuary. Members of the jury, the defendant wasn't sorry. The defendant wasn't concerned. You saw in her cell phone records that not once did she try to contact Don Clark the entire week she claimed he had gone missing. You learned that the defendant cared more about calling a soup restaurant than her own husband, even more than calling the police, because the defendant knew exactly where Don Clark was. She knew that she killed him. She knew that she dumped his body in a swamp so that she could get more power. Members of the jury, when one of us feels out of control, ignored, or powerless, what do we usually do? Maybe we talk about it, we look for practical solutions, or we finally accept that not everything is always going to go our way. That wasn't enough for the defendant. The defendant just couldn't handle being powerless, so she resorted to murder. She made a plan for power. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Closing argument from defense.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Dead or alive? That is the question in today's trial. The prosecution just got in front of you and told you a plan for power. Members of the jury, that's not murder. That's simply a fancy alliteration that doesn't actually prove anything. Miss Getawchew, throughout all today's trial, kept trying to convince you that Miss Bassett murdered Don Clark with an elephant tranquilizer. Well, she can say it as much as she wants. That doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean she proved it, and it doesn't mean they met their burden. At the beginning of today's trial, I told you to ask yourself, is Don Clark dead or alive? The prosecution couldn't answer that, and because of that, they failed to meet their burden. Remember, the burden is the highest in our legal system. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. They failed to meet that burden through the evidence, through their own theory, and because there are alternate possibilities concerning Mr. Clark's disappearance. Now let's go through those one at a time. First, through the evidence. Now, before I go through each of these evidence, what you have to remember is that the absence of evidence isn't evidence. But let's go through those. Today, you heard the prosecution talk about a missing syringe, a GPS record, an algae match, and even a power of attorney. Members of the jury, first, the missing syringe. You heard Agent Branham testify that they don't have the syringe. They don't have footage of Miss Bassett injecting Mr. Clark with it. They don't have footage of her dragging his body or wheeling him in a wheelchair. The missing syringe doesn't prove Miss Bassett murdered her husband. Next, the GPS records they brought up. Those just show where Mr. Clark's van went the night he went missing. It doesn't show who was driving the van. It doesn't prove Miss Bassett murdered her husband. Next, the algae. The algae found on the defendant's boots. Members of the jury, you heard Agent Branham tell you that it was for sure from Big Gum Swamp. But then you saw the forensic report. You saw that the forensic biologist isn't certain because maybe it was from Big Gum Swamp. Or maybe it's from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park that they never tested. The algae doesn't prove Miss Bassett murdered her husband. And then the prosecution kept talking about a power of attorney in today's case. Members of the jury, what they didn't tell you about that document, what they tried to hide from you, was that Mr. Clark knew about the disappearance clause. He was there when they filled it out, and he was there when they signed it. Miss Bassett wasn't hiding anything from him. The power of attorney doesn't prove Miss Bassett murdered her husband. That is reasonable doubt. Next, the state failed to meet their burden because of their own theory. You heard me question Agent Branham about the theory of today's case. Let's review that testimony. You heard today that Miss Bassett was 5'4". Let's pull up a picture of her. Mr. Clark was 6'5". The prosecution is assuming that after Miss Bassett injected Mr. Clark with the syringe, his dead body is lying on the ground. She somehow, being 5'4", lifts 6'5" Don Clark off the ground, places him in a wheelchair, wheels him to a van that wasn't wheelchair accessible, somehow lifted him into the van, drove 139 miles to Big Gum Swamp, where she wheeled the van into the alligator-infested waters, far enough that the FBI and trained dogs never found his body. And then she wheeled back to the van, drove to the Carrie Bell Leone Airport, where she left the van, then somehow got back to the 7 miles where her elephant park is. Members of the jury, that story isn't just improbable. There's no evidence to support it. No eyewitnesses, no security footage, and no physical evidence that directly links to the defendant. Members of the jury, that theory is reasonable doubt. Now, lastly, the state failed to meet their burden because of alternate possibilities concerning Mr. Clark's disappearance. We don't know if Mr. Clark is dead or alive. Maybe if we knew he was dead, we would know what actually happened on August 18th, 2017. But we don't. There's no blood, no signs of violence, no autopsy report, no body, nothing to indicate this man is actually dead. Members of the jury, you heard the testimony of Joe Young. You heard that on the day Mr. Clark went missing, he received a phone call from Costa Rica. You then heard from Miss Young, who actually went to Costa Rica, unlike FBI agent Branham, that when she went to Mr. Clark's property, she found the fan was on. She found clothes in his closet. What did Agent Branham do about this? Nothing. You then saw an email from Mr. Clark's lawyer, Miss Tuminelli. You heard that Mr. Clark had plans to purchase properties in Costa Rica, planned to purchase those properties with money off the books, and planned to do so without the defendant's knowledge. What did Mr. Branham decide to do about that? Arrest the defendant. Members of the jury, in today's case, there isn't enough evidence to support Mr. Clark is dead. That means there isn't enough evidence to convict Miss Bassett. Remember, the prosecution is trying to put Miss Bassett in jail. They're trying to take away her liberties on a hunch, a possibility. Members of the jury, a hunch, a possibility, that's not reasonable doubt. That means the state failed to meet their burden and find the defendant, Miss Bassett, not guilty. Thank you.
Rebuttal, Your Honor.
Yes.
May it please the court. Miss Morris just got up here and asked you if Don Clark was dead or alive. She tried to convince you that Don Clark was alive. Members of the jury, you heard it straight out of the defendant's mouth. If someone stood in her way of protecting the animals, she would take them to the grave. Don Clark disappeared on August 18th, 2017, and he was never seen or heard from again. You learned that Don Clark stood in the defendant's way. Don Clark didn't want to use his power over the elephant park to protect the health of their animals. So the defendant made a plan for power. She took Don Clark to his grave. Miss Morris wants you to believe that it was just a coincidence that on August 18th, the same day Don Clark went missing, so did a syringe of carfentanil. She wants you to believe it's just a coincidence that on that same day, Don Clark's van was driven to a swamp. She wants you to believe it's just a coincidence that the algae on Miss Bassett's boots matches the exact algae from that swamp. She wants you to believe it's just a coincidence that the defendant's fingerprints are on that steering. She wants you to believe that it's just a coincidence that after the defendant says she'll take someone to their grave, miraculously, her husband goes missing. Members of the jury, coincidence after coincidence after coincidence is not a coincidence. Miss Morris's story she just tried to present to you that Don Clark is in fact alive, it's not reasonable. Members of the jury, if the defense's story in court today is not reasonable, then it cannot create reasonable doubt. Agent Branham even told you on the stand today, it's not common in his field for an adult to just pick up, go missing, never to be seen or heard from again in Florida or in Costa Rica, and have them still be alive. Find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So if the jurors would like to submit their ballots now, and we'll just wait a few minutes until I get the go-ahead that they're all in for comments.